Welcome, everyone. My name is Roger Ferguson. I'm the president and CEO of TIAA. And joining me, the very important discussion today will be Darren Walker, who is the president of the Ford Foundation, and Ursula Burns, who just stepped down as the leader of Xerox and is a well-known CEO and thinker in the corporate world. Let me start with the obvious question, which is we've lived through 3 pandemics this year. One is the health one that we know of, obviously. That's led to an economic crisis, a recession. But we've also seen on top of that quite a bit of anxiety with respect to race equity, and social justice equity. Ursula, let me turn it over to you for some reflections on where we are in 2020 vis-a-vis race relations.
From the corporate perspective, I think we're at a very important inflection point. One where companies, large and small, are starting to question fundamentally their approach to diversity, equity, and inclusion. They're starting to question it from a positive perspective. And they have been reaching out more and more to diverse leaders to get some input and insight into how they are doing and actually what is happening. We're still in the talking phase, but this discussion phase has lasted longer than most, full cycles have lasted. And this is I think it's a good sign.
I think, Roger, from the standpoint of philanthropy, the issue of race and racial justice has been an underlying issue that has not been fully embraced. So many of the challenges that foundations are working on, whether it be K through 12 education reform or the low-wage workforce, have race and history at the core. And I do think the conversation is beginning to change. Like Ursula, I am cautiously optimistic.
And I do think this set of pandemics, these crises, has also brought a new light on inequities and inequalities on the campus. Because what we've seen as many schools have gone virtual and remote is there are quite stark distinctions for the experiences of those who have more versus those who have less. But I share the general sense that the conversation at least has now been engaged from both a corporate world, a not-for-profit world, and a philanthropic world. Let me turn to the question, what is the role of educators and education in fostering these conversations and helping us to move forward to some type of resolution?
Well, Roger, I think you and Ursula and I share the story of mobility through education. And the three of us were lucky because we lived in a country at a time when our nation was investing heavily in the public assets, the public goods that made it possible for us to get on the mobility escalator. And so what I worry about today, because it is true that education is the equalizer, but the playing field needs to be level, and the playing field is not level if access to higher education, for example, is limited to those who can afford it or requires families to take on 6-figure debt so that their children can be educated. Young people feel so burdened by college debt that they lose the opportunity to really dream about their future.
I agree with both you and Darren. Obviously, this is going to be a big hug here on the importance of education. And the challenge I think that we have, in addition to affordability of college, we have preparation in high school and grade school, which is fundamentally uneven and unfair. If you live in certain zip codes, it doesn't matter how smart you are, how hard you try. If you live in certain zip codes, you do not have access to a good preparatory education. I benefited from having access to a good early education, a good middle school education, and access to college. So we have to make sure that those 3 steps, those 3 ingredients stay like front and center when we're preparing our next generation.
Well, I agree with you completely. And in my own life, I would say the same thing. I went to public schools here in Washington, D.C. They prepared me quite well to go to an independent high school that then got me into a great college. Without a doubt, there's an entire pipeline that goes back to even preschool education and forward. So I think both of you are making exactly the right point. This is not just about what happens on the college campus. It's everything that leads up to the college campus that also matters.
That's one of the reasons why HEAF is very, very important, right? The engagement early on, so grade 6, all the way through to your walk down the aisle at commencement is needed to, in some ways, to repair the gap that we created in the early parts of education, but also to just literally prepare these students to actually engage in the real world. And hopefully this is a multiplying effect, that they, you help one, they help a couple, and so we can actually get a better overall outcome.
In my own life, I had a similar organization. It was called the Black Student Fund, and again, reached out to us, supported us through, in my case, high school, upper school, with all sorts of preparatory work in addition to scholarships. But importantly, and one of the great things that HEAF does is opens the eyes of these students to the possibility, indeed the expectation, that one will go into college, and it supports them through college. In the U.S., we've managed to get to a stage where about 90% of high school graduates get into college or have some post-secondary education. But unfortunately, the completion rate overall is around 60%. And for students of color and from disadvantaged minorities, the completion rate is even lower.
I think one of the things HEAF does so well, among many things, is that it sets high expectations. These kids need parents, they need people in their lives who expect them to do well and to succeed, and who support them in succeeding. And I think HEAF has really excelled at both setting those expectations and then providing students with the tools, with the supports.
I agree completely. One other thing I have to say about HEAF that I really find fascinating is that it also brings experiences to these students who they're participants. Travel around the U.S. or internationally, giving their participants, their students, a cultural experience. So it's not just the classroom. And I think all three of us would say, at least in my case, going to college and suddenly discovering totally new dimensions of culture that I'd been not aware of before. It created, frankly, some challenges for me. While I was pretty sure I could handle the academics, it was the social, the cultural, the ability to have conversations around the cafeteria table that I felt lacking. I think HEAF really steps in to fill that void as well. So I think all three of us, back to Ursula's point about a big hug, would say big hug for HEAF for everything that it does. Ursula, you were talking a bit about students being ready to go into the corporate world once they get out of college. Can you speak just a bit more about whether or not our pipelines in the business world are sufficiently diverse today, and if not, what can and should businesses be doing to bring more diversity into the corporate world?
So I'm going to speak about two pipelines, because there are the entry into a company pipeline, which is getting more diverse. I think that businesses are making progress in this area. Not enough by any stretch of the imagination, but making progress. But what we found in business is that even if we can get a third of the entry-level people diverse, that by year 7 or 8, 50% of those people are gone. So they don't sustain themselves through the companies. We literally are just not preparing enough people to be ready to take on the mantle of running these large corporations. And what I think we have to do is fundamentally rewrite the game. One of the things that I'm very optimistic about is that this discussion is starting to happen at some of the larger companies that I'm engaged with.
There have now been a couple of really powerful analyses that show that if we can get African Americans and people of color to have the wealth of white Americans, the entire society, the entire economy would be larger by 2 or 3 or 4% or even more.
Diversity is about excellence and high performance and high achievement. You will be better. We don't need to debate that anymore. So this is how I see it, Roger, and I'm so grateful to you and to Ursula for both of your leadership, and to HEAF, because you are doing the work of justice.
I think the optimism is based on the fact that we will not give up. So my optimism is partnered with some of the action and the grind that I see us going through to get the right outcome.
I started in a segregated public school system in Washington, D.C., ended up being the CEO of a Fortune 100 company. We're standing on the broad shoulders and also, frankly, the bent backs of our predecessors, but yet here we are. And so I'd certainly say this is a time for a cautious and realistic optimism. And what HEAF is doing is making education open to thousands who otherwise would not have had the chance to do that. So thank you very, very much, HEAF, and congratulations on the work that you are doing.